Okay then, so looking at some of the adaptations after some flexibility training. So first of all, you get an increased resting length of your muscles and your connective tissue. Your muscles is obviously quite self-explanatory, but your connective tissue, when you talk about connective tissue at your joints, you're talking about your ligaments and more so your tendons. Okay, so how does that actually work then? Well, within your muscles, you've got what's called stretch reflex receptors. And those stretch reflex receptors, we draw a little muscle on, are placed all within the muscle. And basically they're looking at the amount of change in length that there is at a muscle. So if you are stretching a muscle, you are lengthening it. If you are contracting a muscle, then normally when you're contracting the muscle, if you contracting it concentrically, then the muscle's going to be shortening. Now, looking at flexibility, we're going to be stretching the muscles. So stretching the muscles means that you're going to be lengthening them. Now, what your muscle's got built into it is it's got a defense mechanism, and these receptors, these stretch receptors that cause what's called the stretch reflex, are this defense mechanism that stops the muscle from being stretched too far. So if I were to do something like a tricep stretch, like that, I can pull down quite hard, and there comes a point where it becomes quite uncomfortable. So you can feel that muscle being stretched there, being lengthened. Comes a point where it gets uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. If I were to be quite reckless and daft and I pulled down on that muscle as hard as I possibly could, the built-in defense mechanism, the stretch reflex, would actually automatically cause that muscle to contract, because it doesn't want to be lengthening anymore because it feels like it's at risk of being damaged. So it would rapidly contract, and that would stop it being stretched any further, and that is basically your stretch reflex. Now, one of the results of doing lots of flexibility training is that your muscle learns to become longer and to stretch a little bit further, and that stretch reflex isn't quite as strong as what it would be normally. So there might come a point where it becomes a little bit uncomfortable when you're stretching, and it might be that you can take that a little bit further and it's a little bit more uncomfortable. But if I really pulled down hard on that now, that muscle would contract automatically to stop itself from getting injured and getting damaged. Basically, as a result of your flexibility training, you can make that mechanism not quite as strong as it was before, because the body will allow that muscle to stretch a little bit further. What does that actually mean for you in terms of flexibility? Well, a muscle that can be stretched a little bit further means that you're getting a greater range of movement at that joint. The greater the range of movement, then obviously the more flexible you are. If you think about it in terms of sort of sporting performance, something like that, if I've got a greater range of motion at a joint, then I can apply force at that joint for a little bit longer. Think about something like a discus thrower. Discus thrower might be able to, without any training, bring their arm back to sort of about there, and then apply that force to throw that discus. After lots and lots of flexibility training, if they increase the range of motion at the joint, that arm now might be able to go all the way back to there, and that means that you can apply that force of throwing that discus for longer, because rather than it only throwing from there to there, because of the greater range of motion, I can now apply this force from all the way back here, and that allows me to apply more force to the discus and throw it further. So that will be a knock-on effect of you having greater flexibility at that joint, greater range of motion at that joint. Okay, so one of the other adaptations to flexibility training is that you get increased elasticity of your muscles and your connective tissue. Well, what does that actually mean then? Well, it means that your muscles now will stretch a little bit further without the risk of them tearing, or without the risk of your connective tissue rupture and anything like that. So they become basically a little bit more springy, a little bit more pliable. Now, you do get some of these things happening anyway as a result of you doing a warm-up. I mean, for example, if we use the blue tack as a bit of a prop, if you go to stretch a muscle that's cold, then there's a chance that that cold muscle could tear, it could break. However, if you get some heat into your muscles through warming up, just like with the blue tack, this blue tack now becomes more elastic, less likely to break. The same will happen with your muscles. The knock-on effect of your muscles and your connective tissue becoming more elastic as a result of a warm-up, or as a result of an ongoing flexibility training program where you'll get permanent changes in elasticity, is that you'll increase your range of motion at your joint, but you'll also drastically reduce your risk of getting an injury. The other thing, if we look again at the muscle spindles, that's the little stretch receptors placed within your muscles. They'll be happier as well if you've got an greater elasticity in your muscles. That muscle will want to lengthen further than it would before as a result of flexibility training, without these receptors getting angry and thinking, right, we've gone too far now, and wanting that muscle to contract and shorten again. So you'll basically reduce the risk of that happening. You'll reduce the stretch reflex, and you'll also, as a result of reducing the stretch reflex, allow the muscle to stretch a little bit further, all without the risk of you getting injured, because you've increased that elasticity. Okay then, so a bit of an overview then of some of the things you can expect as a result of your flexibility training then. So the main thing is that you get an increased range of motion at your joints. Remember, this is all localized though, so when you're doing flexibility training, just by doing something like shoulder stretching is not going to increase the flexibility in your spine, or it's not going to increase flexibility in your knees or your ankles. So you've got to make sure that you're doing local stretching specific to the joints that you want to increase your flexibility at, and that's handed as well. So if you're working on the right hand side of your body, you've also got to work down the left hand side of your body, the joints on that side. Okay, but yeah, you will get increased range of motion at any joint that you do your flexibility training on and you do stretches for. What does this mean for you then? Well, the knock-on effect of having greater range of movement at your joint is that you've got, as I mentioned earlier, I give the example of the discus thrower, you've got an increased distance for your muscles to create force. If we think of another example, something like a footballer kicking a football, if you're able during your preparation phase to bring your leg back further, and then as you strike the ball, you're able to follow through a little bit further, your muscle has applied a force through a greater range of motion than somebody who's not done the flexibility training, who can't bring the leg back quite as far and can't follow through quite as far. If you've got a limited range of motion, you've only got a limited space in which you can actually apply force of your muscle to actually strike that ball. So the greater your flexibility, the greater force you'll be able to apply over a longer period of time, over a longer distance as well. As a result of having a greater range of motion, you've also got a much greater decreased risk of getting an injury, because it's much less likely that your joint will go, or your muscle will go outside of its normal comfortable range of motion. Obviously, by doing your flexibility training, you've increased your range of motion, so it's much less likely that you'll go beyond where your joint and your muscle are happy with. And then the final knock-on effect of all of this is you'll also get improved posture and alignment. Again, because all of your joints now have got a greater range of motion, it means that your posture will be a little bit more correct, and the alignment of your body will be correct. If you've got the correct alignment and posture, it means that you should, hopefully, when you're performing skills and things, have better technique as a result of better posture and better alignment. And again, better alignment also means, because you able to produce movements as they should be done according to the textbook, and that's always the case if you're a top performer, but if you're able to do that and you've got everything aligned properly, you're much less likely to get injured. Okay, so all these things are kind of connected, all of them though as a result of you having a greater range of motion at your joints.